Hello, 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 everybody, and welcome back to the Starlit Stories podcast. It is me, Stella Marie, and here we dive into the native spiritual traditions, philosophies, and ways of living and being upon the land of Britain and Ireland, or the so called Celtic Isles. So, from Ireland to Scotland, Wales, England, Brittany and France, and Cornwall, and everywhere in between. But today we have got a little bit of a different conversation and a slightly unique guest compared to the others that I've had on here. Here I am having a talk with Gillian Burke. If you are in the UK or you are a watcher or a listener of the BBC, you may have heard or seen her before. She is a biologist, wildlife presenter and passionate storyteller. Gillian was born in Kenya and has a biology degree from the University of Bristol. Her career has taken her from behind the scenes at the BBC's Natural History Unit to becoming a beloved presenter on Springwatch and other things. I am not here to go into the depths of what she has done in terms of, wildlife presenting. You can definitely find that by looking at her on the internet. This conversation is actually about the transformation that she is going through at the moment in terms of how she is approaching system change. That's what this conversation is about, as well as diving into her story. So how did Gillian Burke go from living in Kenya to working with people like David Attenborough? Beyond television, Gillian is a creator and podcast host of If I Ruled the World. This is actually where I met Gillian. She invited me to come on and have a conversation with her, and I loved it so much I needed to bring her onto the Starlit Stories. In If I Ruled the World, she engages with leading scientists, environmentalists, and people like myself on the fringe of society to challenge media narratives and inspire systematic change. With her deep love for nature and powerful storytelling, join me as we dive into her journey, the state of the planet, and how we can all make a difference. Hello, everyone. Yeah, welcome back to the Starlit Stories podcast. You would have just heard a little introduction about who I've got here with me today, Gillian Burke.
It's actually really nice to have the roles reversed. I've not actually sat and been asked questions for a really long time. So it's kind of, yeah, it feels really exposing, actually. I'm like, this is what I put my guests through. I was born in Kenya in the mid-70s. So I'm a solid Gen Xer, as I call it, like right bam, slap in the middle of that generation. And I sort of do think I was really lucky to be born at that time because I did grow up in a world that, the internet was yet to be unleashed for all its good that it does and also all the kind of negative things that have come subsequently with it. So my days were very free. I lived in a time where I was able to play unsupervised. I had a lot of time to myself. There wasn't a lot of pressure with clubs and activities. I was pretty much a free range kid. And so being part of nature, it just didn't even occur to me, to be honest. I grew up on the outskirts of Nairobi. It was like a former, like, where like the estate I lived on was built was like a former coffee plantation. So it was, sort of a new development, if you like. But even so, it wasn't like I was living out in the wilds, because I think a lot of people think that when I say I was born and brought up in Kenya, they're like, oh, wow, did you live like in those scenes that we see on TV? I'm like, nah, that wasn't me. But having said that, the boundary between the human world and everything else was very blurred, especially as a child. Like my toys were natural, was in nature. Like I didn't have many actual toys, not because I was necessarily poor or anything. It was just that I just didn't. I don't even know why I didn't, to be honest. But I didn't think I needed them either, because my toys and the things I played with and my companions, if you like, were. And I was going to sound like so cliche, but it's true. Like you know, there were trees that always got involved in my games. Um, there were plants that, the seeds, the leaves, etc., that were part of my kind of mud kitchen. And even now, like my memory of all those things are kind of sensory. So it's not just the name of it. In fact, I'm not very good at naming stuff, but I can tell you what it tastes like. I can tell you what it
Mm.
smells like. I can tell you what it feels like when you scratch a seed and get, the skin of the seed stuck under your nail. Like sensory, kind of really visceral details is what I remember. So yeah, the whole thing was just kind of part of me. But the point at which I was like, something isn't working or something isn't quite right, or that, all is not well in the world. That kind of thought came really young, and it wasn't really about nature, it was about people.
Mm.
Um, and because we lived on the edge of this coffee plantation, I would see almost daily the workers who worked on the plantation being trucked back and forth. In the morning they get trucked into the plantation, in the evening they get trucked out. And of course, this is back in the day where trucking literally meant trucking. They were loaded onto flatbed trucks and driven in, no safety, nothing. And so, I mean, it's quite a harrowing experience for 3, 4-year-old. But there was one morning on a school run where my dad was driving me into school, not school, it would have been like preschool, kindergarten, whatever. And and he had this like, oh my God, his dream car was this like it was a cherry red Datsun 120Y, for anyone who's into that kind of thing. It was a classic car of its time. And he just was like, we're on this little route, this sort of road, and out of nowhere, he starts trying to get me to look out of the passenger window, the opposite side of the oncoming traffic. And it's so weird the way he did. He's like, look there, look there. And he was trying to make me look out of my passenger side window. And of course, because it was so weird, I didn't do what he was asking me to do. I did the opposite. I kind of guessed there was something, like instinctively knew there was something he didn't want me to see. And that was one of these trucks that overturned. And it was a harrowing scene. And so for me, that was definitely like, I don't know who was on that truck, but I know a lot of the kids that I played with on our estates. I know their parents worked on those plantations. So I wasn't old enough to kind of follow through and find out what happened and who was there. But I just, there were people that were like potentially parents to kids that I played with, kids whose names I knew. And because we were like a middle class family, we weren't that rich, we weren't that poor, just some in the middle. Like, to me, that felt like, I know this stuff doesn't happen to people like me, but it happens to people like them. And
Mm.
that is not right. And that was like the foundation for me of going, something is not right, all is not well. And I don't think I can ignore that. So that's how it started. And then not soon after, it then became um, awareness. Like there was an area, again on school runs, I guess that's where I traveled most to, an area called Spring Valley. And there was one rainy season where a lot of the kind of homes that were, again, workers, people who were like, who'd kind of moved into that part of the city in order to basically work for people who had money. So whether it was as gardeners, as cleaners, whatever. So poor parts of the town built on this like hill. And this one rainy season, and the whole thing just disappeared overnight with what do you call it? A mudslide. So again, for me, that was like, okay, A, that's really wrong. That's happened to these people. Again, I knew people who lived there. Um, but it was then sort of like, I added another piece to the puzzle, which is it, again, in my child's brain, it was like something to do with cutting trees down means that this land isn't stable anymore. This land is hurting,
Mm.
for want of a better word. So that was kind of it. And so it wasn't necessarily that, I loved elephants. I do, by the way, love elephants. I didn't, my entry into all of that, and I've only learned this way later in life. I'm still piecing it together at 50 years old. Um, my entry into this line of work has been quite different to the people that I work with. And I'm still struggling to find a place and a home for that, for these stories, because yeah, we don't do this on Springwatch. But obviously not, because partly it's Kenya, but partly it's people. And there's this separation of people and nature that we can't even tell the stories together.
Mm.
So that's where I'm at the moment.
Mm. Yeah. Here, where I am in South Wales, we've also got in the valleys due to like the coal mining and the way that we treat the land has caused a lot of problems. I'm from the capital city, so I don't know the people out here who have been affected over the years, but yeah, it's happening all over the world, and we're noticing
Mm.
it. And your podcast is like originally was on like system change, and that seems like really big, I feel like the idea of it, but really what we're talking about are like smaller systems. And because you were into biology, you notice the small systems. Like a system
Mhm.
change doesn't just have to be like this big one sort of turn of a cog. There's many from the micro to the macrocosm, and but there are similarities between that which is happening all over the world, and we're all noticing it. Like you, when you were a little girl, you noticed it, and as an empathetic human being, like naturally, we question as a part of the tribe that we're all a part of, like how
Mhm.
can we make a difference? And I think that like it seems like you unconsciously over time had made decisions that were related to that empathy that you had towards the world, the environment and the people, and like perhaps not, I don't know, like were you like choosing to like when you moved out of Kenya, is that where you went to did you go to study biology then? Like is that when you or was it while you were in
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the things that like just a few years ago, so my mom passed away a couple of years ago, but maybe a year or two before she passed away. I can't remember. We were talking about something. This is in Kenya, so she retired in Kenya,
Mm.
and and she was just like, you never could get. She said you never could ignore other people suffering, and she said that even as a kid. So it was really good to have someone who remembers me, almost maybe differently to how I remember myself, confirm something that I've always felt, which is I've always struggled. In fact, I just can't. Like, so it's not even a struggle. It really hurts me to see other people hurt, which sometimes gets me into trouble. I sort of wade in and try and help people. It's not my business to help. But anyway, um, so yeah, the way it played out is my mom worked for the UN. She was a journalist, sort of that was her background. My dad was a mechanic, hence the car thing. Um, and when I was 10, my mom got a posting to Vienna to work for at the time, it was the United Nations Women's Decade or Decade for Women or something like that. And so she was offered to be moved to Vienna so that she would work as their information officer on that whole thing. And yeah, so we moved when I was 10, um, which again was probably a bigger shock to the system than I was aware of at the time, and probably I'm still not completely aware of. Like I get that there must be subconsciously something going on there. But yeah, so it was a huge change. Um, and I had to kind of adapt and assimilate really, really quickly in Austria, in Vienna particularly. And then, I kind of like very quickly sort of just that became the norm for me. And I can't quite remember. I remember being very, very like sad and not quite sure how to attach words to why I was sad, but probably because I was just missing what I knew and what I was familiar with. And I was in a very unfamiliar place, language and everything. But then, I don't know, at some point, everything became normal and familiar, and I was quite happy. Um, and at that point, I guess I also made the most of living in a country that's, or at least a city that's known as like the capital of the arts, like performing arts, especially. So I definitely made the most of that. I did dance, I sang, I acted. I mean, pretty much anything that involved getting onto a stage. I just loved doing it. So I was quite, I guess at that time, an extrovert. And and then, yeah, when it got to the point of like, okay, I'm about to finish secondary school. What am I going to do with myself? I've got to do a degree, da 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 da. And I really wanted to go to acting school. That was kind of the dream. But then I was kind of talked out of it because it was like, that's not a real job, um, unlikely to get work. And especially at the time, and I hate to say this, but like, the thing that put me off was someone convinced me that as a Black woman, I was just never going to get work. I mean, bearing in mind, this is like the early 90s at that point, and I believed that. And I allowed that to kind of change the course of where I was heading or where I wanted to go with my life. So the next best thing I could think of was like, well, if I can't do that, then the next best thing is I'd like to go back to Kenya. I'd like to work for the Kenya Wildlife Service. And essentially, it wasn't any lofty goals. It was like, I quite like the idea of basically being out in the open, maybe bumbling around in a Land Rover all day as my main job. And that was that. That was kind of I had a vision, but no kind of, goals or aims or dream. That was like, I think I could live my days out like that. So I very simply just thought, well, how do I get to that job? I'll do a biology degree. And it was that simple. So I've never had laser sharp like ambition or focus. I've always kind of just gone, what's the next best thing I can do from where I'm stood right now? Um, Sometimes I wish I had. I think if I was more intentional, I don't know where I'd be, but like I'm good with where I am as well. So it's there. But I always feel a bit like it's a disappointment because a lot of people are like, well, I'm not going to be able to replicate that, especially when I'm asked to like, how do I get into natural history filmmaking? I'm like, don't ask me, guys. Good luck. So that was kind of the pathway. So I think for a long time, I maybe stopped believing that I could um that my yeah, I don't know. What did I think for a long time I was just being practical and pragmatic about my choices and decisions. And it was about like, well, I need to stand on my own 2 feet. I need to get a job. I need to earn some money. How am I going to do that with, what's the choices that are available to me right now? That's a very vague answer, isn't it?
Yeah, no,
Why did I do biology? Because I couldn't go act, couldn't act. But weirdly, like it's actually like becoming a presenter quite late in life as well. It's almost like those two things eventually came back together.
yeah,
As being
and as
natural
you
history
said,
presenter.
like, yeah, as you said, people ask you like how to get into natural history TV presenting, and their parents are probably like, well, that's really hard to do. You probably should try something that's a little bit easier, like get into retail or something where you know that you're going to make a living. And it's just funny how it's the opposite for you, where it's like you just fell into it. And, you know, we're I feel for those of us who are like really, really passionate about like creativity and have empathy. Like there's nothing getting in our way. Like we will sort of worm our way around things to not settle for just sort of yeah, that which isn't setting our heart and soul on fire, even though to the outside world it might look like we're being really practical, something in us is being like super rebellious, like I'm actually gonna go and do this thing that yeah, I don't know how to explain it, but I'm just thinking of all of the friends I know that are like us, who are creative and
Mm.
empathetic. We're all doing something that isn't quite like normal and practical, even though it might not be that which we dreamed of as children,
Mm.
it's still something that we felt like comfortable in and felt like we could like belonging, you know, in
Yeah.
in in some sort of way. And yeah,
Yeah.
just
I don't know. I think like it's funny what you said about sort of operating slightly outside of the norms. I mean, I actually don't consider myself that radical or daring, but I guess in terms of how precarious this kind of self-employed existence is, yes, it is,
mm,
I guess.
yeah.
It is risky, but if I'm honest, like I've been self-employed since I was 26, so I don't really know any different anymore. Um, and I think like with getting into natural history filmmaking, it was more like I did the biology degree because I thought that was my ticket to being able to return to Kenya, which is kind of still what I consider my sort of homeland, even though I've not lived there now for like 40 years. But even now, when I think about it, in fact, the older I get and the longer I spend away from Kenya, the more I yearn for some kind of like, and it's not even like anything more than the smell of it. I know it sounds a
Mm,
crazy thing to say, but like the earth, literally, the soil has a really distinct smell and the sounds in the morning, early morning. One of my favorite times is at the sunset when everyone's, leaving work and it's like a busy, busy, busy time, but it's a very short period of time because it's the equator. Sunsets on the equator really quickly. And there's just like this energy in the air. So there are things that are very difficult to explain why what the longing is for. And I'm sure when I get there, I'll be like, oh my God, like, what was I thinking? Who knows? But what was I saying? Yeah, doing things differently. I mean, yeah, so the biology degree basically took me to Bristol, which is where the BBC Natural History Unit is.
Mm.
And I walked past there for 3 years going to and from lectures. Never thought that I'd end up working in natural history. And then once I graduated, I sort of spent a couple of years in the doldrums, like temping, doing all kinds of jobs. Like I was a PA for a while and I can't remember, medical secretary, things like that. Um, and, and again, I know this is going to sound ridiculous, but it's true. I just knew that it was like a job that requires me to wear nylon tights every single day is just not a job I can do. Because like the feeling of that, even now, I'm like, I just felt allergic to it. And I guess in a way that was like symptomatic to it's going to be a desk corporate job or something like that. It wasn't necessarily I had a problem with those things. It was just like kind of the uniform that came with it that I was like, I can't wear that. That's not going to work for
Mm.
me. It also meant that if I'm wearing nylon ties, I'm never going to be outdoors. I'm never going to be active. All these things. So it was kind of
Mm.
it was almost like an environmental cue that told me this isn't your place. You're going to need to find somewhere where you don't have to dress like that.
Mhm.
Um, so that was like, so that steered me away from that, going, okay, I know this is what I can't do. What can I do then? And then eventually, like the penny dropped. I was like walking past the BBC Natural History Unit. I was like, that's that place where they make those films with that guy, Attenborough, you know? And I was like, and I literally walked in again, sort of pre just at the point where emailing was still kind of not a thing to do. So I walked into the building and I went to the reception desk and I said, how do I get a job here? How does it work? And she
Wow.
was such
Yeah.
a lovely woman. And she was like, oh, right. Okay. You need to send a letter to the da da da. You'll need to do work experience first. And she gave me all the details of who I needed to write to. And I did. And yeah, my first job was stuck in the basement of the building, archiving, logging footage for their library. Spent months doing that, never saw sunlight. So, it wasn't exactly what everyone imagines.
Mhm.
Yeah, but over the course of like several years is building up to being a natural history filmmaker. But yeah, so again, it wasn't necessarily a plan, but I knew that it felt more natural to me. And I guess
Mm.
because I'm also, to my detriment, I'm not motivated by money. So it was never about, well, how much will this job pay me, and how much do I think I'll make
Mm.
by the time I'm 30? I wish I'd thought of that, I'll be honest, but it just wasn't the way it was.
Yeah,
So,
it's feeling like you're talking a lot about feeling, like what feels right. And like, it's like for someone to say, well, how do I get into potentially being on a show with David Attenborough, and it's like, well, if you want something like that, you've really just in the moment when your gut is telling you, go into that building and go and ask if you can do something there. Like that's the sort of rebellious nature, I think, of us empathetic creatives, is we do have such a strong sort of, even though looking back, we might be like, at the time, we might not have noticed how strong our internal intuitive compass was.
mhm.
And for me anyway, looking back at the times that have led me to the things I love now, I didn't think it was very strong. But yeah, that's like quite rebellious in this world that's telling us to go a certain way for us to actually just in the moment sort of, yeah, even just like, yeah, you were saying you were extroverted. So maybe it was easier for you than some who are quite introverted, but just being able to go and follow that internal compass is huge. And yeah, so I'd like to just touch on what you said about Kenya and like how that made you feel, like the sunset, the smell of the dirt, and just, being in that environment. Like you're in Cornwall now, right? And I know
Yeah.
that all my friends from Cornwall feel the same way about Cornwall.
Mhm.
Um, they're like, there's not many places, well, there's nowhere else in the UK that has that feeling. And I know it's like that across the UK if you go up to Scotland, Ireland, Wales, but there's something really magical and potent about Cornwall, and the coast there that perhaps, yeah, I'm wondering if you feel like, because you've been across the UK, right? You've explored
Mhm.
different areas. Do you feel like there's something there that sort of gives you that similar feelings to as to how you feel about Kenya, perhaps? I've heard you say that there's community there and you hadn't really felt community before you'd gone to Cornwall. And I'm wondering if there's any link there, or if it's just all sort of coincidental.
That's okay. Wow. So I've never actually stopped to think about how I feel about like the land in Cornwall. And I think partly because I wasn't born in Britain and because I wasn't brought up here. I came here when I was 18 to do my degree. So I've never, yes, the whole time I've lived in Britain, and I say this really cautiously because I'm aware that there are so many people who are born in Britain, who are third, second, fourth generation Brits, whose ancestry are not of these lands, from India, from East Africa, you know, all around the world, who feel very British and have the right to call themselves British. So I say what I'm about to say with respect to that, but my story is different. That's not my story. My story is I came here as an adult. I never really intended to settle here. I felt very familiar with British culture just because of pop music, TV, all that stuff,
Mm,
um, colonization. But so I've never ever really felt the need to feel at home here,
mm,
anywhere in the UK. So I'm always what I call myself a comfortable visitor, a comfortable outsider. And sometimes I trade on the fact that I'm obviously not from here. I don't sound like I'm from anywhere from the UK. So yeah, I don't have that need to feel at home here. But that said, I kind of live vicariously of watching other people feel connection to home. And,
mm,
and what I mean by that is, so when I moved down to Cornwall, I didn't really, so I call it the best decision I never made. By that point, I'm married to the man I get divorced from eventually. And we moved down here, I've got two small kids, and it wasn't really a decision I would have made on my own, but we were, it's something he wanted to do, and I was willing to give it a go. So we moved down here. And like I say, best decision I never made because I settled and I stayed on
mm,
and I still like living here. But when we moved down here, I didn't know much about Cornwall. I didn't know anyone in Cornwall. I didn't appreciate it had this very distinctive identity, which I know that's a lot of what you do, right? And it wasn't, there was all sorts of, ways that I sort of started to unpick, like, oh, wow, there's something different going on in Cornwall to the rest of the country. I almost said Kenya, actually. Um, and one memory in particular, so what I mean by living vicariously through other people's connection with home and with land is, oh, this is quite a long time ago now, definitely pre-COVID. One summer there was an art installation exhibit called The Man Engine. And the Man Engine was like a 3 meter tall, steam powered mechanical puppet that the people responsible for it literally walked it like down the spine of Cornwall. So from the border with Devon, I think it was the town of Launceston where they launched, maybe even further north than that, and basically walked what I call the mining spine of Cornwall. And along the way, it started to become like gather more and more attention. So by the time it got to Camborne, which is like the mining capital of the world, um, uh, sorry, not Camborne, I was in Redruth, the mining capital of the world. I took my kids, we hopped on the train and went to meet the man engine in Redruth. And it's sort of, he shows up with like noise and steam and fanfare and, and it was just like a real event. And when everything finally calmed down and the manager had come to a standstill. And now we're in the kind of the main town square and there's a big crowd that's gathered. There are a few speeches and the usual stuff. And then spontaneously, people started singing like old Cornish mining songs. Never heard them before, didn't really appreciate the meaning behind them. But oh my God, the kind of that swelling of like emotion, I just like it almost moved me to tears. And I was like, this is ridiculous. I'm not even from here and I'm loving this moment. And I know like for someone like me, black woman in what is a not very diverse county, he would be like, oh, why, why are you getting excited about their culture? It's not so much that. It's just there was something about it that made me was like, okay, there's connection here. People have connection to this place and their culture. And it made me feel good just to be around that, even though I couldn't be part of it. So I think that's as close as I can answer your question is that I don't feel at home here, but I do really love it. And I care about this place as well.
Yeah, that sounds incredible. That sounds really incredible. I love carnivals and I love fairs. I
Mm.
think they're so impactful and so important. And I really feel like it's something that we need like right now, actually. Like that's the sort of thing I feel like needs to go into every city. Like if anything's gonna go viral, it needs to be like a giant mechanical being. I saw a video yesterday of one. Have you heard of Lilith? She was from the Bible. She's an old Hebrew
Yeah.
goddess, but today she's a symbol of sort of feminine independence and empowerment because of her story goes along the lines of she was in the Garden of Eden and she disobeyed Adam and then she was kicked out. So and then she went and had children, she went and had babies, and then she wasn't able to look after them, blah, blah, blah. She's a massive sign for that. I don't know where it was, but yesterday I saw a video and someone had created a giant version of her, and they've got this voice speaking out, but she's sort of speaking out as nature, and as Mother Earth and Lilith all at the same time. And I was just like, wow, that's the sort of
Wow.
protest we need. And just watching it, I was just wow, like that's incredible. So I can't imagine, what that was like. And I definitely wasn't from the culture that I watched it on, and I wasn't even there. I was just watching on the screen. And yeah, just creativity is, I think, how, like talking about system change and everything you do on your podcast, I think creativity is really something that in the past, like since we did our podcast together, is something that I'm really feeling like there needs to be more of that, like more expression through creativity, through surrendering, through letting go, through song, through singing, through coming together in these ways that like are seemingly simple, but if they were that simple, it would be something we're doing all the time, right? Um,
Yeah. I mean, I think, I mean, I know that um, colonization, decolonization is a big topic and means different things to different people, I think. Um, but I certainly can, one of the things that I'm starting to piece together is even when you're listening to you there, I was like, creativity was just something we were. We didn't have to add it
mm,
on to our lives, right? I mean, we all kind of appreciate that we're born into creativity. We're born into creative bodies. As young children, it's what we do very, very naturally. The playfulness, the experimenting, mark making, moving, dancing, making noise, and not being constrained with is it good enough, kind of thing that somehow, gets shackled onto us. Um, and through doing my podcast and different people that I've spoken to, I guess some of the things that I'm starting to kind of like, sort of a magpie picking little gems as I go with from one podcast guest to the next is, for example, like work was creativity for the longest time.
mm,
Um, from work songs when people had to work in unison or do long repetitive tasks, or whether it was sewing or plowing a field or building a barn or making a ship or pulling in the fishing nets, or it all involved song. And actually, again, growing up in Kenya, that's something I remember as a young child was listening to, particularly when there was like a field that needed to be prepared for the new season. And there'd just be a day where a group of people would show up. I don't even know how it was organized because I was so young, I didn't notice these things. Um, and they would just go like do the whole field in one day. And there was always song that kept everyone going, and it sort of like coordinated the action. It helped to, and particularly if you were tiring, it sort of motivated you. So it had like so many purposes as well as sounding great,
Mm.
beautiful, whatever, and being kind of energizing and creative and taking you to a higher plane. So many, I don't know what, it's not even like a purpose. It just
It's
does
like
so
it's yeah,
much.
it just it yeah, I mean a lot of people say that like the universe itself and nature itself is a song, like we are a part of like God's song, some people might say. And it is something that although it is innate, it is something that we do need, we need to instill. I sort of when I there are some cultures in the world where it's like very natural to sing in the kitchen while cooking and sort of this wasn't my family. My family are actually quite yeah, like for me with song, my nan would say, "What is that racket?" if I started to sing. So there's sort of some trauma there. Whether it's just my lineage's trauma or me even whether it's like a school in the education system, perhaps if you're looking at the UK in terms of the education system and song. But yeah, there's some cultures in the world where it's sort of like, dinner time is a time for song every dinner time, singing a song, visualizing the mum or the nan singing, and it's just like happy, uplifting. And you said brings you to a higher plane. It literally does, like it really does
Yeah.
raise our state of being, our feeling. And it's so important. And there are songs like I'm imagining with like the mining songs in Cornwall, which did have a sadder tone, and it's like a memory of what's happened.
Mm.
Songs and traditional songs are like they hold our memories, they hold our cultural memories. And I think yeah, that's something that's sort of I feel that's missing in our society. There's so much music and there's so much mainstream music, but what is that saying about who we are? It sort of feels like it's telling us who we are, as opposed to like expressing who we are. And through our podcasts, we're not singing right now, but we're sort of trying to share, through our voice, who are we? What are we doing? What can
Mm.
we do about this, a lot of this corruption and these systems that need to change? And you just touched on some of your podcasts, and I was going to ask you, like, what brought you to actually like ask the question, which is what your podcast is called, like why, like what made you decide like I'm gonna create this podcast that's got such a big question, if I ruled the world? And I know that the song is great. But yeah, what really brought you to ask that question? And has it been answered? Not like you've got one answer and you're like, this is how I'm going to rule the world, but through the different, titles of your individual podcast episodes. Like someone said they would abolish the military, someone said they would green the ghetto, someone else said they would give Indigenous nations a voice. And then you've got like more specifics like justice for Grenfell. You've got so many different answers from so many different people. I'm wondering is there like sort of one thread that you're feeling pull through that? And why was it that you asked that question? I know it's two questions in one, but
Yeah, no, that's okay. I
yeah.
can see where you get, yeah, because it's quite a sort of sprawling idea, which is kind of why maybe it needs sort of more than one question. So so maybe sort of like tracks back into kind of, the journey in terms of born in Kenya, family moved to Austria. A detail that's really important that I haven't quite got in there yet is that although I'm born in Kenya, I'm not Indigenous Kenyan. So my lineage is Indian Ocean Creole, so Mauritius and Seychelles, Sri Lanka, and then one grandfather who was sort of like more West African in terms of ethnicity, West African and Seminole Indian, but he was born in Trinidad. So that was like that part, excuse me, that part of my ancestry were, I guess, part of the African slave trade, the the transatlantic slave trade, which I'm learning to now is there's a kind of movement to change the language around that, because they're pointing out that a trade usually means that there's a kind of reciprocity, there's an exchange, like both parties kind of walk away with something. And so there is a movement at the moment to kind of correct the language, if you like, as part of the healing process, as part of the kind of reparations process as well, which is not to call it the slave trade, but to call it the African Holocaust of enslavement, which is very new to me. So I'm trying to adopt that language as well, as a way of like being able to correct the narrative and shift kind of the lens through which we see a lot of these historical wrongs and traumas, really. So my kind of indigeneity is very confusing. I don't really know where I come from. Um, on all sides of my family. So the best I can do is call myself a Kenyan Creole. And I wouldn't say Creole because I've never really lived in Seychelles. I don't speak Seychellois Creole. If I try, I sound like I'm trying to speak French and I sound really snooty, so I just don't do it. Um, so anyway, so back to why the podcast. That's probably gives you a hint of why it's a sprawling question, a sprawling idea, because my roots are sprawling, literally, right? Um, I yeah, I kind of have claims to almost every continent except Australia and South America, and obviously Antarctica. But I've not been able to kind of, say this is where you're going to stay. This is, and not just physically where I'm going to live, but like mentally, this is the space you're going to exist in, because I don't feel like I fit in anywhere very, very easily. Doesn't mean I'm unhappy, but it just doesn't mean I just don't fit in very well anywhere, really. So as a result, I went, I did my degree, I got, eventually into natural history filmmaking. And for a while, I felt like I was where I meant to be. Um, I had a, really happy relationship with the man that I eventually divorced. I, had a job that I was taking me around the world. It was really exciting. I believed at the time that the job was making a difference, that what I was doing was showing people the wonders and beauty of the natural world. And the more I could do that, the more people would see it, the more people would see it, they'd fall in love with it. Then when they fall in love with it, they care for it. And ta-da, we save the world, right? Um, and then roll on sort of a good 20 years of that. And by this point, I've got very young children, moved to Cornwall, and I've kind of stepped away from my professional life in a very weird way and without a plan again. And I was sort of like back in the doldrums, but now with two small children. And if I'm honest, like, man, that time was really important because they slowed me right down. They forced me to see things in a different way. And what I saw, amongst lots of other things, was I was like, the reality of this story that I'm telling myself and my whole industry is telling us, which is that we're doing a good job here by getting people to watch natural history films on TV. They're going to care about nature. And when they care, they're going to be moved to do something about saving it. And I was like, look around you, look at the indicators, look at the science, look at the research. It's not, it's not working. And that's a really hard thing to accept and admit, that like I don't think this has worked,
Yeah.
or at least it's not working as much as I would like it to. So that was 2017, and that's kind of where the idea for the podcast started to kind of form, although I didn't know it was going to be a podcast, and I didn't know what I was going to call it, and I didn't know that system change was even a thing, but I knew that I was missing something a lot, actually. I was like, I've got some mega blind spots because something's not working and I want to find out why. So I guess it was from a real place of curiosity and feeling like I'd failed, if I'm honest,
Mm.
and just kind of going, it's not worked. I've got to do something different. That's it.
Mm. Yeah. Wow. I don't even know what answer I was expecting. But yeah, it's so true. I mean, we've all watched and been impacted by films, not even documentaries, but you go into the cinema and you watch something and you perhaps watch the hero go through his journey in a film and it's like, wow, like I'm gonna do that. We all do it. If that was me in real life, I would make the right decisions. I wouldn't do what that person in the film did. I would make the right decisions, and then we come out of the cinema and then life goes back to normal. And that happens with the same with like nature documentaries. And like there are some really powerful and impactful documentaries out there who in the moment really change how we feel. But then it's like, how does that change how we are and who we are on the inside is like a very different question, which is what it sounds like. Yeah, you're asking through your podcast, asking loads of people like myself who are wanting to make change and trying all of these different ways, yeah, how to really do this. And there are going to be some people who have watched an episode of Springwatch or who have watched a documentary and it's taken them to go and do something really impactful and powerful. But as you said, like look at the stats, look at the science, like things haven't exactly gotten better in correlation with the amount that we're showing people on a screen. And that's like, yeah, it's huge. It's something that I've recently realized as well. Like, with what I'm sharing online in my space, like I do see people who are really grateful for what I'm sharing and they say it's really powerful and it's impacted them in a positive way. They feel closer to like I speak to a lot of people from America who have got Welsh ancestry and they feel closer to their lineage and their grandparents and whatnot. So I do see that there is a place for it and there is an important reason for sharing ourselves on the screen. It's not an entire disconnect, but for me, what's changed me have actually been things that I can't control. They're experiences and situations that have just been, I don't even know, like not, yeah, just really like this summer I had a really powerful experience. I don't even know how to put words to it with the land. Um, and yeah, yeah, I don't know. This is bringing me to want to talk to you about something that I think about a lot, actually. That is, why is it that a human being can look at the science, can look at like what is happening? They can even look at their local river and see that perhaps something that they're buying or the materials and the ingredients that we're all using are negatively impacting it and that our lives are polluting. Like, where's that disconnect? Like what's going on there? Like, um, and this is where I feel some of your podcast interviews that you've done with people, there is that thread of like, yeah, just coming back around to it, that like empathy and that like really feeling other people suffering and being like, I literally cannot allow that to happen.
Mm.
Um, some of us have that, some of us don't. How can we turn that on in people? I guess that's what we're trying to figure out, right?
Mm.
Um, but yeah, I don't even know why I'm asking
Yeah.
here, but
So,
yeah.
I mean, so that to answer your that observation that you sort of describe of like how can a human being sort of stand by a river and watch it being polluted and then not make better choices about what they're buying and things like that. Um, I think what's changing in the way that I see this issue is that I think for way too long, and I'm definitely part of like the narrative of I've been part of promoting this narrative, which is that we've got the science, we can prove we're right, and now we just need to convince everyone and get behavior change on at scale, right? So whether it's, you know, let's not use plastic straws anymore, or like everyone needs to buy an electric car now, something, whatever that is, right? I think there's a lot that to me, what I'm starting to really um call out, if you like, or maybe not call out because I don't do a lot of calling out, but I think the issue has been placing the burden of responsibility on people who don't actually have any power.
Mm,
And I think we, particularly those of us living in countries like the UK and the US, Europe, where we're kind of living under have for a long time lived under the illusion that we're living in democracies and therefore we have a lot of agency and power.
yeah.
And I sort of, I think for some people who are paying attention, we're starting to realize that is maybe that existed sort of 20, 30 years ago. There was more agency and real democracy, but I think that has become more and more watered down. And I get this from some of the guests I speak to as well. There's some really interesting ideas that have, not everyone says the same thing. But there's some really interesting ideas of why that is and why we are sort of at the moment especially seem to be living in countries where the choices that we have of different versions of government, there's not much between them that
Mm,
really whether, we've got left or right in power, our lived experiences are kind of, the same, all that kind of stuff. And I think ultimately what that suggests is we actually don't have as much power as we think we do.
mm,
And so, for example, when it comes to this idea of like, well, why do we, my question is, and I know this is going to sound like really idealistic and a bit naive, but it is still a valid question, which is why do we have to become so expert in material science to make better choices of what clothes we buy?
mm,
Why do we have to become experts in like chemistry to make better choices about what food we eat? Like, frankly, in an ideal world, and I know this is idealistic, we shouldn't have to know any of this stuff. We should just be able to go and buy food that's good for us. We should just be able to wear clothes that are good for us, use like products, whether it's cosmetics, whether it's, the way we transport ourselves around. Like it just shouldn't, we shouldn't have to worry and make choices about, can I afford to buy the thing that's not going to make, increase my risk of getting cancer in later life? We shouldn't be making choices like that.
mm,
So for me, that's where I'm like, that's why it's a systemic issue. Because
mm,
if we're in a position where the only way to eat food that's not going to shorten your life or your quality of life, actually, but let's put it like that, because yes, we live long lives, but what's our quality of life, right? And there's so much stuff out there at the moment about food and ultra processed food and how people developing diseases, what used to be diseases of old age, are now kind of getting them younger and younger. So whether it's diabetes, whether it's hypertension, high blood pressure, all that stuff, people are getting that younger and younger. And the evidence points firmly to the fact that we're eating more and more ultra processed food.
mm,
So in my world, if I rule the world, we wouldn't have to make those choices in the first place because we would have a system, i.e., governments, regulating these industries properly and saying, sorry, this is going to hurt your profits, but we don't hurt our people. We don't
mm,
hurt the people that have voted us into this position of power. That's the kind of world I think we should be living in. But it's not. So that's why I've probably spent less time worrying about how can I get people to eat less meat, or how can I get people to, change their boiler or get solar panels. Like, I'm like, do you know what? There's a lot of people doing that work. It will make a difference. I'm not saying don't do it. But what I am saying is it's not, I think there's more of us that should be paying attention upstream to where these problems are coming from. And it's absolutely a systemic issue, hence a system change podcast.
mm. Yeah, I completely agree. I was in Extinction Rebellion, and I was the reason I'm not anymore is because the reason I was in it was because I was like, well, I can see what's happening with the world, so I'm changing this thing that I'm eating. I'm choosing not to use this material, or I'm taking the bus more than I'm driving. And if everyone did that, the world would be a better place. And people would tell me, like, no, you're blaming yourself and you're actually feeling guilty and feeling shame for things that are out of your control. And I just didn't see it for a really long time. Like my group of friends, we were like, no, it's everyone's problem. And people would say exactly what you're saying to me for years, and I just didn't see it. I didn't listen. Um,
Mm.
and I think for me, a lot of it was because prior to that way of thinking about the world, I was I really didn't care for it. And one part of that is being young. And it's not something that young children or me as a young teenager should have really been like worrying about. Like, is what I'm eating good for me or my family or the world or the squirrel in the garden? And then so as soon as for me, as soon as I switched that mentality of caring, I was like, well, everyone needs to care and the world would be a better place. But yeah, the reality is that there are people who are um, you know, just some of the richest people in the world, some people who own corporations that, just in their own personal daily activities are doing far more harm than entire communities are doing. And really seeing it from that perspective, I can't pinpoint what it was that took me from that perspective of really feeling like we as individuals are to blame to really seeing that um it is the bigger picture to blame. I don't know what it was that took me from there to there, but since then I've really felt a really big release, actually, like a personal release, like, oh my God, it's not all on me. It's
Mm.
not all on me. It's not all on us. Okay,
Yeah, I
what
mean,
can I
you know,
do?
yeah, look, I mean, we can all make a difference, right? But there's only so far we can go in a system that is the infrastructure isn't there to support us making those changes.
Right,
And it's
yeah.
so simple. Like, if it's more expensive to buy a fabric that isn't sort of like completely impregnated with like various chemicals, so it's not flammable, that's because it's made of plastic in the first place. If that is your cheaper option and you cannot afford anything better, then that system's not supporting you to make better, to make
Mm,
those choices. And ultimately, I kind of go back, I kind of go further back to that, which is like we should be making that choice in the first place. That
yeah.
product simply should not be available. A product that is known to has chemicals in it that are known carcinogens should not be available, full stop.
Mm,
Why is it available? Well, that's another question, but I
yeah,
mean, probably most people will answer in a second, but so
yeah.
it's not a mystery. But what I mean is like, so for me, like I've had to I guess unlearn my own sort of narratives. I've had to unschool myself from the idea because I was a real behavior change. Like, oh, I loved the sound of it. Maybe that's why I like system change. I was just like, let's take one word out, put another word in. Uh, but yeah, I was like, oh, this is all about educating people and da 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 da. And then I was like, oh no, because just take for example, I think it was in 2021, like there was some data that just three companies, were responsible for more carbon emissions than all of the UK households put together. So you tell me, is it easier to go around, millions of households and get everyone to kind of do, or do you just go after three companies,
Hmm.
right? Which is, I mean, to me, I'd say your gains per unit effort, you're going to get more by going after those three companies and trying to get millions of households to change, to do something that you want them to do. So, yeah,
But what
basically.
if then, if the millions of households, say, if a lot of these households, like, they really want that dress, even though it is made out of this certain material and there are chemicals that go into it to dye it, which is destroying a river in India, and they're like, yeah, but I still want that. Um,
Mm,
what do we do then? Because for me, I've always found it very easy to be like, oh, actually, that's better for the environment. I'm going to go for that, or I'll have less of that. I've just found it quite easy to do that. And one reason might be because my family owned a health food shop, so I had a lot sort of at my
yeah,
disposal. But for the first 5 years of them owning it, I didn't care. My mum would give me leaflets and on things and try and show me environmental documentaries and stuff like that. And I was just
yeah,
like, I don't care. I want that dress. I want that bit of makeup. She's like, oh, she would literally say, like, we can order you some natural makeup, f from the shop. We can get some makeup in. And I'd say, no, like, I've been shown by this YouTube guru that there's this specific MAC product or whatever. So I want to go for that. So there's like, Yeah, there is like a lot of people will be disappointed, and a lot of us like, so if we were to change what these companies are doing and we were to have like stricter regulations, a lot of people would miss out on things. But that's just sort of the way I see it. I might seem a bit strict,
Mm.
but that's just the way it's got to be in order for us to really support those that don't have voices, such as the trees, such as the animals,
Yeah.
such as the rivers, these beings on this earth that don't have a voice and they don't have a choice. Like, we really do have to start letting go of some of these things that we've been led to believe are really important. And I'm glad that you feel the same way, because not a lot of people are willing to have this conversation, I don't feel. But I think it is a really important conversation. We're not blaming, we should stop blaming ourselves for, having a plastic toothbrush instead of a bamboo toothbrush. But we've also got to accept that if we were all using bamboo toothbrushes, they might break a little bit more, or you know, do you know what I'm trying to say? We've got
Mm.
to let go. We
Yeah, I
To
mean,
grow, we have to let go, and that's hard.
yeah, and I mean, so that was what one of the things that drew me to what you're doing, the stuff you're posting online on your social media, was this very strong kind of sense that the work begins from within, right? And so that's why, again, where maybe 10 years ago I was very focused on um my job, my purpose, whatever you want to call it, is to try and change everyone else's mind, try and affect widespread change, that's going to make the world a better place, blah 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 blah. And well, first of all, can I swear? It's fucking hard changing people's minds. So, there's that. Um, but then the other reason why was I was like, how do I know I've got the right solution? Right? Because let's say I'm wrong, but I still achieve my aim. Like if I force through my vision of a better world, what if I'm wrong? And, again, I think like I don't hear enough people asking that question. And it's an important question to ask because if you're going to push this thing through, if you're going to force new policies on people, change their lives, you need to know you're right. Or you need to know it's a good chance of having a positive outcome at the end, and they're not going to be unintended consequences. And of course, that's sometimes what paralyzes everyone into not changing at all. But I guess once I started asking a question of like, how do I know I'm right? And second of all, like, what if there's more than one way to do this and I can only see one way? Am I missing a trick? Like, I'm putting all my effort into changing the world through this one vision, through this one lens. But what if there are other solutions that I'm missing? What if there's a whole different way of doing this that I've not spotted? So that definitely was another kind of journey into kind of wanting to speak to as many people as possible. But very quickly, what I started to realize was that there is a decolonization process that, the story, and it means different things in different places. So that's why I use the word very loosely. Um, it definitely is a different process depending on who you are and where you are and where you live. But one thing I would say is and I guess that's what I mean, why I was so drawn to what you were doing. Like it tends to be seen as um sort of a Black, Indigenous, people of color territory, decolonization. But actually, I would stick my neck out and say everybody needs to decolonize, even the colonizers. Um, and I don't and actually I don't know, like I can't fully explain what that means and what that process is because I'm still in it. So the more I've kind of gone into this kind of what's not working, what are the barriers, why does the work the way it does, the more I have to admit the painful and uncomfortable truth is I'm having to acknowledge how colonized I am in my mindset, in the way I see the world, in my language and everything. So for me, like I'm like sort of going through, it's very unsettling. very unsettling, actually, I would say. Um, Especially because I'm like, God, I'm 50 years old and it's only dawning now. You know, I don't have much time left. How much, this, I
Mm.
wish I'd known this. I wish I'd known all along. I wish, you
But
know,
yeah, but if you knew all along, you wouldn't be here interviewing all of these people with this big question,
yeah, I might have been, I don't know, who knows, God knows. I mean,
you know? No, but
it's my personal journey. I don't, it's not
yeah,
really, it's not we, I'm not doing it with the sense of like, well, how can I change myself to change the world? It's actually like and it's not what I thought was going to happen after a year of doing this podcast, at all. But what I've realized is that it's impossible to have the conversations I'm having with people like you
mm.
without having to go, oh shit. Yeah, I got work to do.
Hmm. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, I feel the same with the people that I interview as well. And although I'm quite niche, usually on my podcast, actually, this is quite an out of the box one. I'm realizing that I want to actually, since being on your podcast, I want to start talking to more people about different things. And yeah, like, so you've had a huge shift in, like, I guess, purpose for your podcast. Would you say that's the best way to describe it? Like what you initially thought the purpose was is like sort of shifted, or um and it seems like you're, like we were talking a little bit before we jumped on here, that you're not going to be on Springwatch anymore, and you've got some, yeah, you're shifting in what you're doing.
Yeah.
Has the
Yeah.
podcast like sort of been a cog in that?
I mean, I think it's been one cog in that. So yeah, so I in the past week have sort of taken that decision that I think my time is I'm done with that, which is really hard because it's such a big part of my identity for other people, like not necessarily for me, but I sort of worry that I'm going to like fade into insignificance and irrelevance the second I stop doing it. But I just have to have faith and trust that it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Um, but basically, I mean, I think by the time I got to the point where the podcast was launched and I was actually recording and launching and uploading episodes onto wherever, um, I think I already had a hunch. I was like, okay, this is probably, this is going to be in the territory of like big kind of mindset shifts in order to kind of really see things differently. Um, what I didn't necessarily appreciate was how, because I was like, I'm a black woman. I've like lived in Kenya, I've lived in Europe, I've got family in Seychelles and Australia and Canada, like all these places, I'm very international. I'm not colonized, or at least if I am, it's just a little teeny bit, And I think that has been the biggest surprise for me is I was like, oh man. Um, yeah, so that's sort of one part of it. But I think, if I'm honest, like a much, much bigger shift. I don't know how political you get on your podcast, so but it's very
Yeah,
hard to ignore.
go for it. Yeah.
But like this year, especially with what's happening in Gaza, but even before, but I think Gaza and Israel and what's happening in Lebanon and Yemen and Syria and Sudan and DRC, like all these places, the fact, but I guess the kind of the light is focused like a laser. Um, Terrible analogy, but that sharp focus on what's happening in Gaza is like
Yeah.
there's an active genocide that this country and the US are enabling and complicit in, and we can't stop it. And I think that to me, this is like the alarm bell should be ringing in everyone's heads, even the people who think it's the right thing to do. I mean, wherever they may be. Yeah. Like, because it really suggests to me that we're in a very, very scary, dangerous place. So for me, that's kind of why I'm like, this has gone beyond talking about, when's the best time to hang your bird feeder up. It's sort of, we're in a really, really big crisis, and it's bigger than can we decarbonize quick enough? Can we get out, litter pick our way out of like a plastic pollution crisis? Because to me, ultimately, and I guess again, this is why it's like you need to go upstream, stop. Like I need to, and anyone like me needs to stop focusing on like the little people, because then we're almost like the tools of the oppressors, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're kind of on all these people going, you need to buy better stuff, you need to eat better food, you need to da 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 da. And actually, what we need to go is, hang on a second, you're the guys with the real power, men and women with the real power. You are supposed to be working for us, and we're telling you we don't like what we're seeing in Gaza, and we would like you to stop. And we would like you to stop using our taxpayer money to go and kill women and children and innocent people. Like I said, this is one framing, and I'm very relieved to know that the International Criminal Court see it that way too.
Mm-hmm.
I know there are people who don't, so I don't know what to say about that. But so for me, like a lot of things feel like they've just kind of crunched into the end of 2025. Sorry, where are we? 24. And I've just gone, I think I need to just like I can't participate in this system completely anymore.
Mm.
Like it just doesn't feel right. And it's very scary. I don't quite know where I'm going with it, if I'm honest. And I may really regret it. You can interview me next, living out the back of my car. But it really feels very profound, and
Mm.
it feels like it's bigger than me. Maybe that's why I sort of feel like I can do it. Because
Mm.
before I always felt like, is it just me that feels like there's something out of whack here? Is it just me that feels like maybe there's like, power hiding that's making things happen the way we don't want them to happen? But it's so obvious now
Yeah.
that we have so little agency. The vast majority of Britons and Americans would like there to be an arms embargo, would like their tax money to be used to, maybe help people who've been flooded in Wales this week,
Mm.
or in North Carolina a month ago, um, rather
Yeah.
than sort of like you know what I mean. So that's kind of why. That's kind of why I'm choosing to do what I'm doing at the moment.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's really, yeah, it's brave, and not even just like brave, like and courageous for the world, but like you're not sure where you're gonna go. It's similar to where you when you walked into the natural history documentary area in Bristol,
Mm.
and you're like, I don't know what's gonna come from this, but I'm gonna go and do this anyway,
Mm.
because yeah, you know that it's right. Something's guiding you to, um, yeah. Wow, this has been a yeah. I wasn't sure where this conversation was going to go, but I knew
Good.
that we both felt very, we've got activist souls, revolutionary souls.
I think if, again, depending on sort of what ecosystem online that you live in, this may be the biggest thing that's ever happened, or you'll never have heard of it. But really through speaking to, and I think you'll find this interesting because this story of colonization and language and identity and culture um, it's echoed right around the world, right? As
Mm.
as sort of colonization kind of ripped around the world, this story has played out many, many times. Um, and earlier this year, I spoke to a man called Matua Mark. Well, his name is Mark Peard, but Matua is sort of like a Maori term of like respect. So Matua Mark. And he's a radio presenter, podcaster, and really kind of sports, very entertaining. And I've been listening to a podcast that he co-hosts with two other Maori. So they're three Maori men that have this podcast called The Morning Shift Show. And it's out of New Zealand, which there is a movement at the moment in New Zealand. The Maori want to, and more than just the Maori, actually, there's a move to changing the name to Aotearoa New Zealand. So Aotearoa is the Maori name for New Zealand before it's called New Zealand. So what
Mm.
they'd like is for it to be known as Aotearoa New Zealand. Um, anyway, so I got Mark onto the podcast, and he mainly because I was like, I don't want an academic or historic. I want like a living, breathing knowledge just a culturally relevant knowledge of like what Maori culture is to someone who lives it and is it now, rather than like it being talked about like some ancient practice or some, kind of
Hmm.
like all that stuff. So I thought he was a great person to do that. And so this was a couple of months ago. I spoke to Matua Mark, and he explained that New Zealand, well, Aotearoa, land of the long white cloud, is almost unique in its in its story because it was never truly colonized. It was never ceded. So a treaty was signed between 100 Maori elders and the King of England at the time. And the Treaty of Waitangi was like a partnership between the two peoples. So as far as the Maori elders were concerned, they weren't giving their land over. They weren't ceding it. They were saying, no, okay, you're here. We'll work together with you, but on equal terms as equal partners. And this year, a bill has been tried to push through Parliament to change those terms, which the Maori are like, no, we don't touch this treaty. These are our ancestors who made this deal, and we are not, it's not our place to change it. And also, there was like unfavorable terms for the Maori, of course. So we got into the story of like language and the power of language, and then just last week, there was this viral moment. The youngest MP in the Aotearoa New Zealand Parliament performed a haka right at the end of the bill, where she kind of got up. You may have seen it, and she tears like neatly in half, and they perform a haka, and that sort of came off the back of a big march that had been going on called the Hikoi. So it's a really big movement, and although mainstream media has covered it a little bit, anyone paying attention in Indigenous culture spaces will see that as like a really important moment where through my understanding of where the Maori are today, they are where they are today because they were never truly colonized. They had to fight to keep their language and their culture, but they're very strong. And partly because of the geography, that the Maori, the way Mark put it, he's like, their ancestors paddled past Tonga, they paddled past all these beautiful tropical islands, and they just kept going until they got to like Aotearoa, and they're like, this is the land that we're going to have. And so, they were that extra bit, they were a little bit more gnarly than everyone else. They were real warriors, they're real fighters. And because they were so far away, when the colonizers arrived, they were like, wow, if the natives get restless, we're outnumbered, and it's going to take years for any people to come for backup to arrive. So he was like, so their geography plus their fighting spirit plus their culture plus their language, all those things combined have meant that they've had a really strong identity and and therefore like a really strong pool from which to have this latest kind of uprising, which is we're saying no to this, enough. And there is a sense that this is sort of almost could be the spark for like a movement for other indigenous cultures and for just decolonizing in general. It's really inspiring for anyone who's not been tapped into that. I would 100% be like, just search haka on your favorite search engine and just MP Parliament haka, and just that's your gateway into what I would say is one of the most exciting things happening in the world right now.
Yeah, I'll link it in the description. I was literally in tears when I saw that video, and not long before then, I believe it was in Australia, a woman had a woman had done something similar.
Hmm.
Yeah, an
Yeah,
Aboriginal
she
woman. She was
heckled.
actually talking
Yeah,
to the king. Yeah, and I
yeah,
saw those two videos within the space of a week, and I was like, okay, something's shifting. Something really is shifting.
100%. And I just wanted to kind of close it off because you might have noticed I've sort of glancing down. I've been trying to find a quote, which probably captures everything we've been talking about,
Hmm.
which is, kind of taking that focus away from like the little guys like you and me who can make some change, but only so much we can do, and really making sure we are kind of directing this demand for a better world to the people that are responsible for making the way it is at the moment. And so I've been during the US elections, I was very energized following the US Green Party candidates, Jill Stein and Rudolph Butch-Ware. So again, if you're not aware of who they are, then check them out on social media. Just refreshing to hear politicians, people going for actual seats of power, talking about, just talking about social justice in a way that makes sense, And so on one of his social media posts, I mean, again, they use the power of social media a lot, Jill Stein and Butch Ware. But
Mm.
there was a post that Butch Ware did, and he's a university lecturer and academic. He's historian, studied Black liberation movements, all that stuff. I was going to say really important stuff. And so he he read out a Kwame Ture quote, which I was like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I've been doing for most of my career. So he says, and I hope I got this right. He says, um, so liberals focus on influencing the oppressed rather than the oppressors. Liberals often caution the oppressed against being too radical or extreme rather than challenging the oppressor's actions. This dynamic gives liberals a form of power over the oppressed, though it is limited, as they are powerless among the oppressors. And so I just thought, it was like, that. I mean, it's sort of like one of the things you need to kind of hear it the way Butch Ware says it. I might send you the link just because
Yeah, yeah,
it
yeah.
has a much more of a swing to it and makes more sense. He's also a hip hop artist and rapper, but I
Hmm.
just I do think that's kind of where so much of why we just don't get traction, because we spend so much time trying to change um people downstream
Yeah.
rather than turning our focus onto the people causing the problems in the first place.
Hmm.
And I also, I'm very hesitant around a lot of identity politics. So I use words like decolonization really carefully, even though it's a thing,
Hmm.
because ultimately, to me, the way I'm starting to see the world is that it's not a race, it's not religion, it's not gender. It's literally who are the oppressors and who are the oppressed.
Mm.
Because when you see the world like that, there's a lot more of us in the oppressed bin than the oppressors. And when we understand that that's what unites us, then I think we have the power to really make things change.
Yeah, that's the best. That's the best way that I've heard anyone say it, and what I keep trying to word. Like, I think I said it in your podcast, but not in the best way. I was like, there's good people and there's bad people.
Mm.
And I was like,
Mm.
wait, no, that doesn't really do it. And the divide and conquer tactics that are, throughout history, as a way to conquer, is bringing us who are oppressed, the people, um, to be divided through, um, yeah, arguing and fighting amongst each other and putting blame upon each other, when really there's someone causing us to do that in the first place, and those are, yeah, as you said, the oppressors.
Mm.
And yeah, that's a perfect way to finish this podcast. I just like what you just said just reminded me of something. So let me just see if I can, and I'll send you this song after, and I'll put everything we've spoken about in the link of this podcast for everyone. Uh,
Yeah, and I'll send you the link to that Butch Ware because he says it way better than I will ever. Um,
Oh, I can't find it. But yeah, there's a song called Grow by United Vibrations, and it's a really beautiful song.
Mm.
And yeah, it's all about how yeah, we are the 99%. Um yeah, we can overthrow the 1% is basically the idea. And we can come together and do that in so many different ways. Decolonization is definitely, like, as you said, like, I mean, it's a buzzword. I've got people who were like, oh, I don't know whether I should touch it or this, what, but it is what it is. It is what it is.
Mm.
And as
Mm.
long as we're on the path towards doing that, I think it can only really go up from there. There's no perfect way to do it, as we've spoken about. There isn't one way. It's
Mm.
just about trying and caring and deepening ourselves into our empathy and our love. And that's really what it's all about. Not Yeah, yeah, that's just really what it's all about.
Amazing. Well, listen, thank you so much for giving me the space to have a conversation like this because it's yeah. I'd probably I probably haven't had a conversation like this, sort of that I know is going to go out there into the world. And I do feel like I've spoken as me more than, I probably ever have, because I've been
Mm.
busy trying to fit fit what people think Gillian from Springwatch should sound like. Um, and yeah, this is me. So thank you.
Mm. Yeah, no, thank you for being so, yeah, I guess vulnerable and raw and brave and creative and empathetic and following your intuition. Because if anyone's on here asking, like, how do you start a podcast like me and Gillian have, like, just do it, you know?
Yeah.
Just follow your heart and yeah, it will work out. So thank you so much, Gillian.
Thank you.
And everyone go over onto Gillian's podcast to listen to, yeah, you interviewing me.
Yep.
Some different conversations, the same threads being pulled through. And yeah,
Yep.
goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.